Hey guys, this is Wolfie D from PG-13. Check out my podcast, Live and in Color with Wolfie D, every Monday at noon. We're talking Memphis, we're talking ECW, WCW, WWF, everywhere that I've been. We even have some great guests, some Hall of Famers on the show with us. Every Monday at noon, Live and in Color with Wolfie D.
Everybody, welcome back once again. It's the King of All Wrestling Media, Gene Jackson here with another episode of the Jackson Interaction Podcast. Appreciate you joining us. If you haven't already, make sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Main Event Comedy, over on YouTube. And also, we have the audio version available through Stitcher and all the other different means of getting podcasts. So you can check that out through Spotify, all those different places. But you know all about that, so we're going to get right down to it. We're going to get going today. You guys know that I have this odd fandom, fascination, whatever you want to call it, with Herb Abrams Universal Wrestling Federation, which has led me to have a Facebook group dedicated to that, which led me to have a 12-episode podcast with broadcast Bob Anderson, where we discussed the UWF. He tapped out after 12 episodes, so I don't know that he'll ever come back or not. But I always like to talk some UWF when I get the chance. And I noticed a fellow on Facebook was posting quite a bit about the UWF, and he's friends with Steve Ray, and apparently they've got some things cooking as far as UWF goes. So I just reached out to him and said, hey, man, why don't you come on the podcast? We'll talk some UWF. We'll talk about what you and Steve's got going on. And so we're going to do that right now. So I want to welcome my guest at this time, Mr. Michael Kevin Lovett. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing super. Thank you, sir. It's an honor.
Hey, glad to have you, man. And so I guess before we get started, just for a little context, tell us a little bit about you and your connection to professional wrestling and kind of how you got into it.
Well, I broke into wrestling in 1999. I think I was 23 years old. You know, I'd been a fan all my life, and I was presented, at the age of 23 with an opportunity to get involved with it. And with a local Tennessee group, or, mid-Southern group called Southern Extreme Wrestling. And that was run by Sir Mo of the tag team Men on a Mission. And I got a little handful of training at the old Excalibur gym in Madison, Tennessee, and started working, whatever matches I could, as green as I was, as long as I could tolerate the potatoes they were laying on me and the potatoes I was laying on them. But, long story short, I got married the first time and she didn't like me being involved with it. So I walked away trying to be the family guy. But, the road led me back, and, had another run in TWR, Tennessee Wrestling Revolution, in 2005, a few matches in 2007. And, but, after that, wrestling just dried up. In the 2000s, at that point, at least in my circle, Tennessee wasn't the hotbed for wrestling that it once was, back in the days of, the USWA and the CWA. And all of that, and you just didn't have as much going on. So after that, I got an opportunity to move into acting, and of course, that led back to wrestling. So here I am.
Man, it's wild you say that. I got trained and got involved in wrestling in Mississippi around the end of '97, and same exact thing. I married my first wife. She hated wrestling. We would spend a week and a half to 2 weeks fighting about every booking that I took, and it got to be another week after it was done. It got to be, it just wasn't worth, the trouble. And so I got out of the business for a while, and that's when I started writing for websites, and eventually got into wrestling podcast. And the very front end of it, back in like 2007, I was, Blog Talk Radio. Back when it was just me and maybe 4 other people doing podcasts. Now everybody who's ever drew a breath as doing a podcast, and that's cool. But that's why I've kind of ducked in and out of it at different times. But
Same here.
so
Same
yeah, we
here.
have a similar background in that. I am fascinated though with the acting. How's that going for you?
It's going good. We have some films out right now. My film that I was in, A Soldier's Secret, that was picked up by a larger studio, and it's going to be hitting that version of the film. The Lonesome Soldier is going to be hitting theaters November 3rd. So, that's going to bring some attention my way, even though I'm not in that version of the film. It's still going to bring some attention to the original and me and all of us that are in that. So, and Enchantress is out there making rounds. I got a role in that one. And a few others. So yeah.
So we'll dip into that for just a minute because I do find it kind of fascinating. A lot of people are fascinated by acting and people being involved in movies and television and things like that. And people kind of romanticize, what it would be like if they did it and how it would work. So what to you was the most surprising thing once you got involved with acting? Like, what to you was like, oh, this is nothing like I perceived it to be going in, or was it exactly what you perceived it to be?
I had thought that there was going to be this long chain from the bottom to the top, but it seems like it's a really short chain, and like you could be a big star from one day to the next, and it all just depends on how fate falls. So that was the main thing. I thought it was this long road to the top, but it really doesn't look that way.
Nice. Is it like wrestling where it's a lot about, networking, where, kind of get your foot in the door on a project, and then as you meet people and they meet you and they like you and they open doors, is that kind of how it works, I would assume?
Absolutely. From my experience, it does feel like it's who you know and the chemistry that you have with them, and it's either there or it's not. So yeah, I agree with that.
Nice. So we'll circle back around to wrestling because that's what most of the people, that tune into this podcast, it's between wrestling and comedy because that's my two worlds. But
Yes.
so I don't usually like to say my age on here much, although people can kind of figure it out if they look in the background at my wrestling fandom and where it all is rooted in. But I'm 46 years old. So Herb Abrams UWF, when it came around back in 1990, I was 12 years old, 13 years old, and I was a wrestling fan that if wrestling was on somewhere and I knew about it and had access to it, I was watching it. There was no good wrestling or bad wrestling or any of that. It was just, it's wrestling. I love it. I want to see it. And so, I'm from down south. I live in Alabama now, grew up in Mississippi, and we didn't have access to the UWF at that time. I read about it in magazines. I was every wrestling magazine I could get my hands on, I could get a hold of, I would read them. And so I followed it through the magazines. Eventually, I was able to get a hold of a VHS of Beach Brawl. And so that's the first actual UWF show I saw. And then eventually I got a hold of some of the other, VHS tapes and kind of went into it backwards. Eventually years later, as I got into tape trading, I started seeing more of the TV shows. And as I got older and then involved in the business, my perspective on a lot of this changed. But before we dig into all that, tell me a little bit about where you picked up UWF and kind of what your take on it was at that time.
Again, it's almost the same as your story. I came across it in the around 90, 91, and I'd grown up in the 80s, and I had gotten so used to that marvelous wrestling setup we had of having like three national level promotions between the WWF, the AWA, and the NWA, and the AWA was fading away, and I wanted to, as a fan, to get back to that marvelous setup of having all those options. And I stumbled across the UWF, and I think they were on ESPN at the time. And there were it was reasonably good production, and they had some faces I recognized, and I enjoyed the product. It was a nice alternative to the other options of wrestling on television.
It was, and like I say, without even seeing any of it, as you're looking in the magazines, and Bruno Sammartino's involved, Captain Lou Albano's involved, Cactus Jack, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, B. Brian Blair, people who were big names in the, at that point, Cactus Jack hadn't been, but he'd been a big name in independence. But all these other guys were big names in the WWF. Eventually, Andre the Giant makes an appearance, and you're like, oh my
Right.
God, they don't get literally and figuratively, it don't get any bigger than Andre the Giant. Like, this is real. There's something going on here. So when did you start to get to see more of it? Was it kind of like me, like later on down the line after it was kind of already gone, or did you get to see it while it was happening? Or
As the videotapes became more available, I got some videotapes, and access to it in other areas, and but the main thing was the videotape, like we talked about.
right. And I was a fan of because I was such a huge fan of WWF in that era. Like, I was a fan of Craig DeGeorge. I was psyched when he came on board as an announcer.
Right,
I
I
was like,
was
hey,
excited too. I had seen him on some speedboat racing, I think, on ESPN shortly before that, and then he showed up. He showed up on the UWF.
because I really love those old Coliseum videos. And I mean, I remember, I don't know why certain weird things like this stick out in my head, but I remember like one Christmas, I got the Jake the Snake Roberts Coliseum video for Christmas. And it was
Right.
hosted by Craig DeGeorge and Johnny V. And I've probably watched that thing, I don't know how many times in my life, So, and I mean, let's face it, regardless of how you feel about the UWF or Herb Abrams as a person or whatever, we can all agree that he was not the greatest play-by-play guy in the world. I mean, it was probably the right move to move Craig DeGeorge in there when they did and get Herb out from behind the microphone. Or did you enjoy him?
I mean, he had a different style. I think it's all in your personal taste, all in everybody's personal taste. Granted, he was over the edge and a little bit hot on the microphone. I think, at times hot meaning, loud,
Yeah.
but still, I do think he had a spark, and it was interesting still, to an extent.
Have you gotten the opportunity to read the book, Tortured Ambition, the story of Herb Abrams and the UWF that Jonathan Plombon put out?
I have not. I have not. I've been meaning to.
I highly recommend it. I watched it. I mean, I read it probably about this time last year, about the time me and Bob started up the podcast. And man, he talked to just about anyone who is still alive that was accessible to talk to about the UWF. He interviewed them at length. It's really, really insightful and really tells the story of pretty much the UWF from conception to the end. And I think he was fair. Like, he called out some of the silliness and some of the stuff that, is just, there's no nice way to put some of it. But, he didn't really rake him over the coals like a lot of people do,
Right.
in retrospect, going back, so I thought it was really well done. And I always recommend it to people, like I say, whether they're a fan of it or not. I mean, it is definitely a unique and interesting story. Not just the story of UWF, but Herb Abrams, the guy,
Right. Right.
is a very interesting and unique story as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, I would like I say, I would highly recommend it. So, what stands out as, some of your favorite wrestlers from the UWF area era, I should say, and some of just some matches stand out to you.
I was drawn to Wild Thing Steve Ray in my teens, just his look and his charisma and all of that. And anything he was in, I was just drawn to. And then, the quote unquote shoot match with Steve Williams, comes to mind.
Yeah,
That one, not sure really why. I still don't have the whole story of what went on there, but that one definitely stands out. And then all of that. I mean, every bit of it is it just drew me so strong.
so I saw enough of it so sporadically that I didn't realize until I started getting the entire library of television, and I've started putting it on Main Event Comedy, our YouTube channel. We're in the process of putting all the episodes of the UWF Fury Hour up. We're up to 36 or 7. We'll probably have it finished out before the end of the year. Although I was recently contacted by YouTube, I had to take down Beach Brawl and Blackjack Brawl. I was told that a couple people own that, and I guess they don't own the TV because I haven't got any flack over that. But it wasn't until I started watching the TV consecutively, starting at episode 1 and watching it through, and then Jonathan, makes mention of it in the book. At what point did you ever recognize, like, Jesus, they do not, there's never a clean finish in a main event. Like, that is the most non-finished DQ count-out ridden shows that have ever aired. And I mean, like, I dare you to go through the first 20 episodes of the Fury Hour and find me a clean finish in a main event.
Well, I got you. I agree with you on that, but I don't know. Nitro could probably give him a run for the money there. I'm not sure about that.
I mean, so to kind of dig into that, like, all right, I agree. I get that to some degree, but like Nitro, so you knew watching Nitro, all right, we're building towards a pay-per-view. Like, they want us to watch Nitro every week, but it's ultimately, they want us to buy Bash of the Beach. They want us to buy Starrcade, Halloween Havoc. Until Beach Brawl came along, when you're rolling through the first few months of UWF, it's like, well, where are we headed here? Like, what is this building to? Like, we're not really, we're not getting any finishes in the main events. We're not building towards an event. And at that time, in the late '80s, early '90s, wrestling television primarily existed to promote house shows. To promote buying tickets to house shows. But UWF wasn't running house shows. So it was a wrestling TV show, that existed solely for the sake of a wrestling TV show. Do you think, in what you know about it, do you think a lot of that was just the matter of, Herb was an outsider? I mean, you've been in the business, so you kind of know how this goes. Like, Herb was an outsider. He's a guy who started his own company, so he'd never been in the business. He couldn't be like, hey, man, I got all these years under my belt of booking this and that. Do you think it was just a matter of Herb didn't want to sit these guys down and be like, hey, man, I need this guy to win tonight, and I need you to lose tonight? Do you think that's why it was like that, or do you think that was just by design? He thought it was better to string things along and, keep things open-ended?
Looking back at it, it does look like, yeah, they're trying to keep the fans guessing and trying to keep things sporadic. But at the same time, I don't see that there was that intricate chain of command with a wrestling promotion like you have with, the others like WCW, WWE, where, Vince has, all these people, helping him run things.
Right.
And, UWF just looks like it was a handful of people putting that thing together. So that probably has a lot to do with it.
Yeah. I would think so. You mentioned something a couple of minutes ago about the weird shoot match with Dr. Death and Steve Ray, and I would love to get Steve Ray on this podcast at some time to kind of talk some UWF, and I would just love to hear the story behind that match, because there's a few different versions of it. Like, there's people that claim that Steve Ray had slept with Herb's wife and he had paid Dr. Death to rough him up in the match. And there's all these different stories out there. And that's one of the things in the book that really wasn't cleared up, as far as, what was the reason behind that. And it was so bizarre, because you could tell things got off the rails a few times during the match, but in the end they shook hands and everything seemed to calm down at the end. So it was just really,
Right.
really bizarre.
I don't pick up a vibe from him like that actually happened. Granted, I wasn't there. I was like 12 years old at the time, so
Right.
I don't really know. But I don't pick up that vibe from him like that actually went on, like, because he doesn't seem to harbor any resent towards Herb or any of them. So I don't personally feel like that actually happened. But again, I wasn't there, at 12 years old or 13 to make the call.
Well, man, I'll tell you this, like, at that time, Dr. Death had the reputation for being one of the biggest, baddest dudes in the business, and he earned it. He went to Japan
Right.
and, fought that style. And you got to give Steve Ray credit. If he did go into that match with any inkling that, Dr. Death was upset or he had it in for him for any reason, he didn't back down. I mean, that match, like right out of the gate, like he's kicking Steve Williams right in the face. Like, and that's how it kind of clued me in right at the beginning. Like, something's off here. Cause I mean, I've seen a ton of Steve Ray matches. I've never seen him just front kick people in the chest and face. And I mean, he went right after Steve Williams. And I was impressed with that. I was like, well, man, if he knew something was going down, he was going to let it go down. Cause buddy, he held his own,
Right, absolutely. He's still a big guy.
So you've done some acting with him, correct?
Yes. We did the film, the faith-based film, The Last Passage by Timeless Dreams Productions and director Linda Lee. It's a faith-based film. I played the role of God. He played the role of the devil, and we had a tremendous chemistry on film, and it was just great. He had all of us rolling, and charismatic guy. So yeah, it was a wonderful experience. I'll never forget it.
He's a guy that, watching UWF at the time, like I always assumed that, whatever happened with UWF, if it fell by the wayside and things played out kind of like they did, I always thought that Steve Ray was going to be a guy that would break out and end up in WCW or WWF or both. I'm really shocked that he didn't have a bigger wrestling career beyond that. Knowing him like you do, did he choose to kind of move away from the wrestling business more towards acting and other things, or was there an injury, or what was the reasoning that his career kind of went away?
As I understand, he walked away to dedicate to being a father, and that was the story that I got. But you're right. He had tons of eyes on him, and then he just vanished. So that's as I understand it, he wanted to be a dad, so he chose that path.
And that's commendable, but I I definitely, especially around that time as the cruiserweight division started being a thing in WCW, man, I really could have seen him breaking out in WCW in that division, and possibly finding his way to the WWF through those means. But, I know you've alluded to on Facebook here and there, and I don't know how much you can or want to talk about, but you've talked about kind of having some things in the works as it relates to the UWF, and of course there was kind of this resurgence in interest in the UWF in the past couple of years when the Dark Side of the Ring episode came out, and there was a lot of people suddenly Googling Herb Abrams, and it brought a whole nother generation of people. Got them out looking for UWF content and questions, and it was definitely a good time for Jonathan to put that book out. Can you kind of tell us, any hint of kind of what you guys have in mind or what you're working on? Or
well, we have the film going on right now, so that's going to bring some more eyes to us. And as far as anything else, it's just kind of a law of the farm thing. You got to lay the seeds before you can enjoy the harvest. So, right now I'm doing, making appearances, getting the brand back out there, and he's doing the same. So, we're going to see where it goes.
So is that wide open that you guys or anyone could run a modern day UWF? Is the ownership of that tied up anywhere, or have you guys made moves towards, trying to, make a claim towards it?
As I understand, there are moves going on, but again, I'm not that far on the inside as far as being with the other guys that are involved. But
Right.
we're going to see where it goes.
Before this Dark Side of the Ring episode, came up, and like I say, there was just kind of this resurgence and interest in the UWF. There's a guy who was on Facebook that called himself Herb Abrams Jr., and he was, talking about bringing back the UWF. And I think he actually ran some shows as UWF, I believe, if they were real. I don't know. It may have been some kind of fantasy league thing or something that I wasn't aware of. I don't know, but I just kept seeing this stuff popping up, Herb Abrams Jr., and he was talking about all these shows coming up, and there was going to be another beach brawl and all that. Do you know anything about that, what that was?
Right. I've seen it. I'm not sure who this guy is or if there's a legitimate, connection there. But yeah, I've heard about that guy. I've seen his stuff. He's got like he's got a guy called the Real Steve Ray, and it's a guy that's like really skinny and looks like he's about 12 years old, but I mean, looks like it's a roasted Steve is what it looks like. But but yeah, I've seen him. But yeah, no.
I mean, I'm quite sure he's not legitimately Herb Abrams Jr. by any stretch. But yeah, I assumed it was some kind of parody account or something. But I thought, well,
Right.
if he is trying to do something, it may screw things up for other people who are trying to do things. So, who knows? But yeah, we've got the Herb Abrams, we got the Herb Abrams UWF Universe group on Facebook. So if you're a fan of UWF, if you're curious about UWF, we invite you to come join that group on Facebook. We kind of was keeping it active while we were doing the podcast, and then when we stopped, it kind of died out for a while. But we're trying to get it, going again. I've been posting up as we post the new episodes of Fury Hour to YouTube. I post about them on Facebook, and I would love for people, to become more active in there. Share stories, share memories, clips, whatever you got, in there. And like I say, it's just a really fun, for a number of reasons. It's a fun promotion to go back and watch, and it was just an interesting point in time. And it got some guys, some opportunities. I think it put Paul Orndorff back on the map, and Steve Williams, and like I say, guys like Steve Ray, and a lot of guys that we wouldn't know who they are if UWF hadn't existed, and shine that spotlight on them. So hope people
That's
join
right.
up. And I love that belt hanging in the background back there, man. I was always a fan of the Sports Channel TV title.
Yes, sir.
I want to get me one of those at some point. You remember, so like when they had the Blackjack Brawl, and UWF had kind of been, in and out at the time, and then Blackjack Brawl comes up, and all of a sudden, almost every match on that card was for a title, and there were all these UWF titles that suddenly existed that you'd never really heard of in the past. Like there was some kind of like odd ones on on there. I wonder what happened to all those titles, if the wrestlers that had them on the show ended up with them, or what's become of
Let's see. One of the managers wound up with the actual belt that's behind me. That's a replica there behind me. One of the managers, blonde-haired guy, wore white. I can't think of his name for the life of me, but
them. Or was it Colonel Red?
I think that's it. I think he's the one that wound up with the Sports Channel TV title. The World Championship just kind of disappeared, as I recall, and it just went away. And I've seen pictures of Steve with one of the tag belts, but I think it might be Sunny Beach that has possession of that one, but I'm not sure.
Well, that's cool, because I know belt collecting is a very big thing, and I'm
Right.
sure some of those belt collectors, and well, all the memorabilia collectors, a lot of them keep that stuff quiet because they don't want people coming after them, making them offers they don't want to refuse. As you've seen, I
Right.
don't know, for people who have watched that WWE Most Wanted Treasures show, they've tracked people down and offered some ungodly money. I would have to think that. Oh gosh, who's the MMA guy who was a manager in AEW recently?
Oh, I can't think of
I
it.
can't think of his name, but he's got an absurd collection of old school wrestling belts. Like I forget which belt they went down. I think when they were trying to track down the big gold belt, they went down to see if he had it, and they ended up buying a couple of other belts from him. But like he's just got, just tons and stuff from the old territory days. I would have to think, because he's down in Florida and has been, I have to think he's probably got at least one ring used UWF belt in that collection somewhere. Because we're talking, he's got hundreds of them. So Dan Lambert, that's the name I'm trying to think of.
Gotcha.
Dan Lambert. So I would assume he's probably got one. I may be wrong, but I would like to think so anyway. But
Right. I'd be more interested in the more obscure belts with the UWF, like the MGM Grand Championship, or The other belts.
They had that Southern States belt, when they started running those shows down in the Carolinas, all of a sudden there was a green Southern States belt that was like the old style, like the national title in Georgia and like
Oh,
the belt
nice.
they used to have in Memphis. And, Bob Orton and Mr. Wonderful swapped it back and forth a couple of times, like around episode 41 or 2 of Fury Hour by then. Like that was around the time that like all of a sudden, so they go from running like the Penta Hotel in New York, and they'd been running out in California. Well, all of a sudden they were running in the Carolinas, and it was all of a sudden like a Jim Crockett revival. Like you had a Southern States belt, you had Jimmy Valiant, you had Ivan Koloff and Vladimir Koloff and Pez Watley, Helmut Hessler, and all these people who had been doing independence around there. It suddenly had a really different feel to it all of a sudden. But that was an interesting belt. I would love to see who ended up with that. But like I say, the only people I know that officially held it was like Orton and Paul Orndorff. So probably ended up
Gotcha. There were a slew of those belts that had a very short list of title holders.
Oh yeah, like I say, some of those belts I think had just been handed out for that Blackjack Brawl because I had never heard of them previous, and then and of course they didn't do another show after, so you didn't hear of them since. But it was almost like
Right.
a Clash of the Champions show. Like almost every match was I think every match may have been for a title, but it was like there was a midgets title and a ladies title, and I
Right,
mean
and
there was
that
that Jewish wrestler had like a
Israeli championship.
Israeli championship. I'm like, is UWF running shows in Israel? I don't know.
No, I think Herb may have had some Jewish heritage, and that may have been where the Israeli
Yeah.
championship it came from. That's probably what it was dedicated to. But that may have been the theme of that pay-per-view for every match to be a championship match. But when you do that, when every match is a championship match, then it's not the spectacle
Oh
that
yeah.
that it is when it's just 3 or 4 championship matches. And even Jim Crockett was kind of like that in the late '80s. They had a lot of championship belts, and I mean, I love the look of them. Love having them around, but when you have that many, it does tend to diminish the value of them.
Oh yeah, and they were redundant because you had a United States champion and a national champion, and a
Right.
United States tag champion and national tag champion. Like that's the same thing. Like what are we doing?
Right. Well, I think they eventually retired the national when they brought the United States in, but as you say, I do believe they were on television at the same time for at least a while.
Yeah, they overlapped a little bit, and I think Cornette maybe somebody's explanation for that said that the reason they did that for a while was obviously they kind of all ended up there together because they had been separate territories, and then
Right.
Crockett kind of bought them out. But then also you had, on any given night, Crockett might have been running a show in the Carolinas, and then he might have had somebody over in the Central States area. Then he had a show running down in Florida. I mean, there could be 3 to 4 Crockett shows running on any given night, and he wanted to have 2 or 3 championship matches on each card. So
Right.
that's why they kept all those belts around. And eventually, as the territory started dropping off, they started dropping the title belts. So
Right. Of course.
it it all makes sense. But I'm just happy that there's been a renewed interest in it. Like I say, you can say what you want. You can pick. I mean, you definitely can pick apart the booking. There's all kinds of things you can critique about the show. But like you said, in that era, there had been WWF, Jim Crockett Promotions / NWA, and the AWA. And for Herb Abrams, a guy from outside of the wrestling business, to just come out of nowhere and start a promotion, hit the ground running with a national television coverage on the sports channel, and get guys like Paul Orndorff and Bruno and Andre and all these people we mentioned. I mean, like I said, that turned some heads. Like because there was startups, there was guys trying to start promotions all the time, and of course, all of them are like, we're gonna take down Vince McMahon and we're gonna own the world. But he was the first guy to like have some television coverage behind him, have some big names on his side that you were like, whew, wait a minute, this might be something, and maybe I think in the end that's probably I mean, I think he kind of had to do that to do what his intentions were, but at the same time, you know, we got an old saying in the South, you know, get too big for your britches. I think he started out too big. If he would have started small and maybe grew into that, but, you know, when he had that pay-per-view, they hadn't built up a big enough audience in Florida to fill that building.
Right.
And so it got him in debt. It got, you know, people's, you know, perspective of them, you know, perception of them, I should say. You know, we're like, oh, they ran that building. You know, they ran that building.
Right. And I think it was just, you know, being unknowledgeable of the options there with when that arena, I think it was the MGM Grand that was so empty. Like for example, the SummerSlam here in Nashville, I can't think of when it was, but it was a half house. But you know, they closed off that part of the stadium, and they didn't show that. And you know, and the UWF could have done that with that event instead of you know, just showing all those empty seats. So yeah, I think it was just inexperience there.
You know, and that's the thing. Like if I think if Herb would have had some people who had his and the company's best interest at heart that knew, I mean, because guys like Steve Ray were so young in the business. I mean, what could Steve really know on that front?
Right.
But wrestling being as it is and the wrestler mentality being as it is, they just look at it as like, oh, here's a bunch of guy with a bunch of money that don't know any better. How can we drain him of every penny? Rather than being like, hey, let's help this guy succeed, because in the long run, we all succeed. We all have a place to work. And in the end, we can make more money in the long haul if this company's successful. They just look at it as like, man, let's bleed this dude for everything we can get. And, you know, if he'd have had more help from guys with the experience who knew, you know, it could have been a different story. But, you know, we'll never know. But like I say, it's fun to go back and watch. And I'm glad, you know, guys like you and Steve and different people are help, you know, keeping the name out there and, you know, have hope for, you know, making it something in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, hey man, before we go, tell everybody, you know, like you say, you've got all these projects going on, you're acting and, you know, got UWF stuff. Tell people, you know, how they can follow you on social media and keep up with what you got going on.
Oh, well, you know, you just pop my name into Google, my full name, Michael Kevin Lovett, it's right there. So yeah, you just Google that name, go to IMDb, you know, you can see my film career there. I have a YouTube channel, I have some of my film stuff there. Check out Timeless Dreams Productions, check out director Linda Lee. Definitely check out the UWF and see what we've got going on. And hey, we're going to be coming at you.
Awesome. Well, hey, it's been a pleasure talking to you, man. Thank you for doing the show. And as things progress, you know, keep me in the loop. Be glad to have you back again and keep people updated on how things are going.
Totally. Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, man. Have a good one.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Give Me Back My Pro Wrestling, the podcast that's based on the old school, but can still help you find the good stuff from today. Dangerous Dan Colley, the Professor Jimmy Street, and the Plastic Sheik Jared are the undisputed six-man tag team champions of the wrestling podcast world. From thought-provoking topics to superstar interviews to action figure expertise. This trio does it all, and all they ask is, give me back my pro wrestling! Every other Thursday, wherever you listen to podcasts.